What's up, guys? It's Double Zug. So I know in the intro video to this series I said the first one would be about mana management, but I lied. It's not. We're going to start from the beginning and just, go through level 1 to 5 in order. So this first video is going to be about level 1, right, which is just reacting to raid damage, like the basic ground level of healing. I'm mostly going to talk about here optimizing your UI to make it a lot easier to just do the basics. I'm going to be talking about like your attention as a resource, and then I'm going to be talking about like key binding a little bit too. First of all, for UI, I talked about this a little bit in my UI video that I'm going to link below that has like my profiles for Raidframes and stuff like that, but UI is incredibly important for healers. It's like way more important than I think it is for DPS and for tanks to have a really good UI. And the central thing about that that's like the most important is your raid frames, right? Because your raid frames is how you see what you actually have to heal, and it's going to be how you track most of your debuffs and buffs. The first category here is you can't heal what you can't see. So very, very important. You should be setting up your raid frames to reduce visual clutter, to make it really clear who needs healing, who needs dispels, etc. Super, super, super important. You should be doing this before you even attempt to do any kind of healing, is you should have a good UI. Again, the center of this is your raid frame, so you definitely should not be using default raid frames. That's like terrible. Just don't use them ever. So there's 3 add-ons that I would recommend use for raid frames. The first one's Grid 2. This is the one I'm using right here. This is my main add-on. I think it's the best personally. There's Voodoo, which is like very similar to Grid, except its configuration looks like it was designed as like one of those old HTML websites mixed with like Windows 95. It's labyrinthine. It's insane. When you open the options menu, you'll be driven mad, and it'll be very, very intimidating if you're not like computer science major or whatever. Grid 2 is a little bit less like that. Its configuration menu is a little bit more approachable and a little more intuitive than Voodoo. Personally, you can do a lot of the same things you can do with Voodoo with it, although it does not have like click casting built in like Voodoo does. The third one I'd recommend is Cell. And actually, I've just been messing around with this a little bit. I think it's pretty good. If you want something that's like very, very configured and looks nice out of the box, you don't really have to mess around with too much for it to work well, I'd use Cell. But honestly, like, I think Grid 2 is the best. The big reason why is just that Grid 2 uses the least like CPU and memory, and I think if you're playing on like a lower end PC, honestly, like even in retail with like a really nice PC, I sometimes get FPS drops with Voodoo. I think Cell is like pretty good, but it's just a little bit less configurable. So either use Cell if you don't want to mess around too much, or like just use Grid and copy my profile. Just make sure you're not using default frames. Honestly, they're terrible. What's the first thing to mention here? Set up your raid frames to have high contrast between health bar color and missing health color. This is actually something that I think is very important and underrated, which is that if you see here, if I take some fall damage, you'll see that the empty health color is like almost black, and the missing health color is almost white. So there's obviously really, really high contrast between black and white. It's like the most high contrast possible, right? This is really, really useful and something underrated. I think a lot of people, like, they have just class colors on their health bars for some reason. It just causes a bunch of visual clutter and is kind of pointless. I would recommend having class colors on your names and having your health bars be like a uniform color when they're full, and then have the missing color be something very bright and high contrast, like white. Or there's like a disc videos I've watched who plays retail. I think he has like super bright violet, like neon color for missing health. Something that's super noticeable, that pops, it's bright, that you will be able to see out of the corner of your eye when you're looking at your weak ores or you're looking at your feet. Yeah, you want missing health to stand out and full health to blend in. You want to be able to see people getting chunked in your peripheral vision and have it stand out. So yeah, I would not recommend putting class colors on your raid frames. It's just visual clutter. It's pointless. It's just, there's no reason to. Second thing I'll mention here is place your raid frames in a central location that is easily seen but doesn't block your position too much. Personally, I have my raid frames in like the center bottom here. I have my command center weak aura here, target, player, target of target, and then I have my cast bar at the very bottom. If you play DPS or whatever, you're probably used to having your raid frames like on the side or somewhere on this, tiny over here or wherever. If you're a healer, you want your raid frames to be as close to your character as possible while still leaving a little bit of a gap so that you can actually see ground mechanics as close to your character and as close to your like rotational weak cores as possible, so that your eyes have to move the minimum distance to like go between them, and also so that you can see feet out of the corner of your eye when you're staring at your raid frames and vice versa. You really want to be reducing visual noise as much as possible. Anything that's cluttering up your raid frames, like random buffs and debuffs that you don't care about, just remove it. Set up screen to have the least possible visual clutter so you aren't distracted. So like anything that's on your screen that you don't look at, that's not useful, that's not like, don't have your action bars shown. just hide these. You should know all your keybinds by heart anyways. We'll talk about keybinds a little bit later, but like have everything bound, have it just muscle memory so like you can hide all this stuff so that your screen looks super clean. Your screen should look like a fucking modern minimalist house, like one of these houses that's literally just like a box that's like white with the fucking steel windows or whatever. It should look like a trendy, minimalist, modern house. Like that fucking white box with like black steel windows or whatever. You do not want it to be looking like a giant castle with like all this shit going on. You literally, you want your UI to look like a male college student's dorm room where it's literally just a bare mattress in the corner and like one chair with a fucking GameCube and a CRT on it for Smash Brothers Melee or whatever. You want there to be basically nothing. No ornamentation. You don't want it to have like sexy map where it turns your minimap into like a fucking spinning rune gleaming thing in the corner that's just gonna distract you. You want no visual noise, no clutter, nothing. You want just the things that actually matter and nothing else. I would literally even recommend like just disabling your chat, close your chat windows, close your fucking details. Like there's no reason to have a bunch of details windows open just so that you can like go look at your fucking DPS numbers during the fight. Like have everything that you don't need to see hidden. Yeah, again, if it's on your screen and you don't look at it regularly, just remove it. If it's there to be pretty, remove it. Just cull everything, bare minimum visual clutter. Honestly, like you might think this doesn't really matter that much if you have like a crazy spaceship UI where there's a fucking million things on screen all the time and you literally just turn 90% of it off. You will notice instantly that everything feels way better, especially as a healer. Again, yeah, close chat details, like anything that's not relevant, especially if you're just starting out, like you don't need to have your details open. You don't need to be like looking at death logs during the fight. Also, like if you're just starting out and you're trying to get better, like you shouldn't be tracking most raid cooldowns. You should try to pare down like your DBM, or if you're using like a Foji weak aura for timers, or like on retail if you have whatever weak aura pack, like turn off everything that you don't actually need so that the only timers you can see are the ones that actually matter. And the more of this like visual clutter you remove, healing will feel 50 million times better. Just trust me. The other thing to mention about Raidframes is that the more you have this like high contrast, it's really easily noticeable, the easier it is to do like, this is more of a level 2 skill, but I'll just mention it here, which is like having heuristics for danger. Example here is like if a person drops to X% in one global, I'm always going to use emergency heal. Example is on Disc Priest, like if somebody drops 80% rather in one global, and I just see that out of the corner of my eye, I'm like conditioned now to just always press a power word shield on them as a heuristic, right? And if you just do that, it's going to save people's lives, and it's a lot easier to have that heuristic and that muscle memory if people getting chunked is easy to see. So that's like the basic UI stuff I'd talk about, mostly centered around raid frames and just removing clutter. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something that's incredibly important, especially and particularly for healers, but this is also relevant for DPS and tanks as well, which is that your attention is a limited resource. So you can only pay attention to one thing at a time. You can only really do one thing at a time. Multitasking is like mostly a meme. And this is like super relevant for healing because we actually have like one extra thing to do that DPS and tanks do not, unless they're like raid leading or something, which is that as a DPS and a tank, what do you have to look at? Well, you have to look at like your rotational abilities, your cooldowns, and then you have to look at your feet, your mechanics, your positioning, right? So you have like your level 0 basic don't stand and fire stuff that you have to pay attention to, and then you also have to be staring at your weak auras and looking at your rotation and sliding your cooldowns and stuff like that. So you split your attention between those two things. If you spend too much time staring at your fucking action bars, you're going to die to mechanics. If you spend too much time staring at mechanics, you're not going to do enough damage, you're not going to be tanky enough, etc. Well, what do healers have to pay attention to? Well, we have to pay attention to the same two things that DPS and tanks have to pay attention to, which is mechanics and your rotational abilities and your cooldowns. But we also have a third thing, which is our raid frames, right? So we have to look at our CDs, our rotational stuff. We also have to not stand and fire, and then we also have to be spending as much of our time as possible looking at our raid frames and not looking at these other two things, right? So because we have that third thing, and because the more you stare at your raid frames, like there's literally like a massive correlation between how much time you spend looking at your raid frames as a healer and how much HPS you do and how like safe your raid is, how many people you can save from death. So it's kind of a funny thing, but you'll often notice like the quote unquote good healers who are doing like the highest HPS, who are blasting, who are always getting that power word shield on the person who drops, who are always getting the NS on the tank when they drop, or just on top of the ball. They'll often, especially in early prog, just fucking flop and fall over to mechanics that like you might otherwise think would be easy or like not that hard to deal with, right? Like they're just randomly standing in fire, and then you'll look at the meters and they're doing 10x the HPS as the next healer. This is not actually just because they're bad. I mean, it is bad, obviously, to stand in fire or whatever, but like the reason why that happens with like the quote unquote good healers is that they're limit testing on how much of their attention, which again is limited, right? You only have so much attention, and they're limit testing how much of that they can be spending on their raid frames. And like they're trying to minimize to the absolute bare minimum the amount of time they actually have to spend paying attention to mechanics and paying attention, obviously to their cooldowns and their like weak cores and stuff. So yeah, again, that's the reason why you'll often see good healers die to really dumb things, especially during early prog. It's because they're actually correctly trying to minimize the attention they spend on those things and maximize the amount of attention they're spending on their raid frames. So the other thing I'd mention here is that sound cues, particularly, as well as like minimizing your weak auras and your timer clutter, can help a lot with this. So sound cues specifically, right? Because you can be staring at your raid frames, and if you hear a sound cue, or even like calls from your raid leader on Discord, anything like that, that doesn't require you to look away from your raid frames, but will let you know what's happening, can be very useful. So having sound cues, like I know Foji's pack does this specifically for Kata, right? There's packs that do this in retail that will call out frontals and all that kind of stuff. Anything like that will just minimize the amount of visual attention that you have to take away from your raid frames by using your auditory sense it's just super good for healers. The other thing I'd mention is like the timer clutter. Like if you have like DBM or whatever, or you have a weak aura pack that does timers, disable things that aren't relevant to healers. You should only have the timers up that you actually need to be looking at. Everything else should not be there. So you can quickly look away, instantly get like the 1 or 2 timer bars that actually matter, and then within 1 second you're back at your raid frames. The third thing I'd mention here that's like it's a little bit of a tiny min-maxy sweaty thing, but I think it's important to mention because it's something that will differentiate you, and if you should be thinking about doing this and learning to do this, is to use between globals and cast time to look away from your raid frames. This is a little bit of an abstract one, but like hopefully I can explain it well here. Basically, like let's say I'm looking at my raid frames, and let's imagine my raid frame is the tanks, right? So let's say I've decided that the best thing for me to do in the next 2 globals is to power word shield the tank and then cast a prayer of healing on the tank group. So what does that mean? I've now decided what I'm going to do with the next 3.5 seconds of time, and that means that during the global of power word shield and the cast time of prayer of healing, I can now safely look away from my raid frames and look at everything else. I can look at raid cooldowns, I can look at timers, I can look at my weak auras for, whatever cooldowns, I can look at my mana bar, I can look at whatever I want to. I can, plan where I'm going to be positioning next. And I'm basically losing nothing, right? Because I'm already committed to a cast. And so staring at my raid frames while I'm casting a 2.3 second cast time prayer of healing is just wasted attention, right? I lose nothing and I gain a bunch from using that cast time to look away. And then once the cast is done, I look back and then I decide what I'm going to do with my next couple globals. And so you're sort of cycling, like a really good healer will cycle back and forth between like planning out the next 2 globals and then looking away during those 2 globals and then looking back. And the only real downside to this is that if you ever do have to like cancel a cast to save somebody, the more attention you pay to raid frames during that, sometimes it is correct to cancel a cast, so like do emergency heals or like NS or whatever, but like usually you should just mostly be trusting your other healers to fill in the gaps between your globals, because obviously your globals aren't all going to be synced up. So there's a trust thing there, and if cancel casting is like usually pretty bad for your overall HPS for all the healers, right? So you kind of just want to be trusting your other healers to catch the things that you don't catch. So yeah, that's a little min-maxy thing you can do, kind of sweaty, but again, important to mention. Something that will differentiate you is just being really good at min-maxing and like managing your attention and spending your attention not on your raid frames while you're like during casts, right? The other thing here, which is kind of a meme, is like, again, your attention is a limited resource, but how can you increase the total amount of attention you have? The best way is just to like do drugs. So nicotine, caffeine, stimulants. Go to your doctor and tell him you're having trouble concentrating at school, and he'll give you Adderall, and then you'll be able to parse hundreds or whatever, because you'll have artificially increased IQ and attention. So this is obviously a meme, like, don't do drugs, right? It's bad. But yeah, there are ways to like become more focused. Maybe listening to music helps you focus. Maybe it hurts your focus. Obviously, like being healthy and getting good sleep and all that stuff is going to make you better at everything in your life, including WoW. And the true degen sweaty gamer is, you know, eating right and exercising and getting sleep so that he can parse higher in WoW. Yeah, it's just, you know, obviously this is kind of a meme. But again, like, anything you can do to increase your focus is going to make you better. The other thing here is clear comm. So this is not really a problem I have. I don't really get distracted by like people talking in Discord, but if you do get distracted by people talking in Discord, just mute people that are distracting and not saying things that are important. And then you can, you know, you can keep your raid leader unmuted or whatever, but if you really do get super distracted, just mute everybody. The other thing here is that focused practice is going to always beat /played. So if you're learning something, being focused on learning, reflecting afterwards, thinking about things, recording your gameplay and rewatching it, that's something that I've been doing recently now that I've been starting to post videos, and honestly it makes me fucking cringe, man. Looking at my gameplay, I just always notice 50 things that are terrible. So that's obviously super sweaty, but if you want to improve quickly, that's something you can do. Also, I'd recommend like you don't start autopiloting until you're actually good. So yeah, basically if you're watching this video, you're probably already doing focus practice, right? Because you already obviously care enough to be looking up YouTube videos of how to be better at healing. So that's the attention section. Now we're just going to talk about keybinds a little bit. So there's a couple things here. Mostly keybinding is a little bit personal, right? Everybody's hands are different sizes. Everybody has different size keyboard. Everybody has a different mouse. I would recommend not playing WoW with a mouse that has less than like the 2 side buttons and obviously like a scroll wheel and a middle mouse button. You don't want to be using one of those like 2005 Apple mice that's just one button or whatever. I think most mice nowadays have baseline the 4 buttons or whatever it is, but some people really like the MMO mice. I personally don't use one, but they're kind of nice. You honestly, like, you don't need that many keybinds unless you're playing PvP and you need like arena 1, 2, 3 for every single thing and like focus for every single thing. You don't really need that many keybinds, so the MMO mouse isn't like super important, but just bind everything. Obviously don't click your spells. So there's a couple of healer specific things, right? So use your binds for instants that you use when you move that don't compete with your movement keys, right? So if you're moving, you're mostly going to be moving by aiming with your mouse and strafing, or you know, maybe you have forward bound. You don't really necessarily need to have forward bound, but just have the instance that you're always going to be casting while movement. So like for Disc Priest, what is that? It's Power Word Shield, Palm, Renew, stuff like that, right? So have those instants on binds that are easy to press while you're strafing and while you're aiming yourself with your mouse. Kind of an obvious thing, but worth mentioning. Don't have your fucking instant on like P or some insane StarCraft Brood War binding. The other thing to mention here is to have macros, have @tank macros for those instants. So personally, if I'm not targeting the tank, I have a macro to like @tank palm that I sometimes use while I'm moving. That's like a very minimal rather, min-max thing, but can be useful. The other thing to mention here is similar to the point I made during the attention section where like you can look away from your raid frames between globals or during cast time. While you're in a global is when you can move, right? So if I cast Power Word Shield, this is something you can use for caster DPS as well, is like if I press Renew and I'm on a global, all the time I'm moving inside that global is like not reduced uptime, right? So whenever you have instance, it's a good opportunity to be repositioning yourself. So that's keybindings. Again, keybindings are pretty simple, just, you know, kind of a personal thing. Just have everything bound. Have the things you use while you're moving in binds that you can press while you're also pressing your strafe and aiming. The other thing I'd mention here is just like use mouse overs and use click casting. The less actions you have to do to like target and then cast a heal on somebody, like you literally just gain free extra globals if you click cast and mouse over cast as a healer. It's just, there's absolutely no reason not to. It's just free HPS pretty much. So yeah, that's level 1. Next video I'm going to do is going to be on spell selection, global selection, and then after that we're going to do stuff on like having a plan, and I'm going to talk about mana management in that 3rd video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you were entertained.
Swobu! Zug Zug!